Good morning. It's 9:02 and we have a 9 o'clock appointment. Welcome to the Community and Economic Development Committee meeting. Today is May 18th. Kevin Cross, the chair, and if you will, we'll go around and make introductions, starting to my left or my right.
George Martinez.
Christopher Constant.
Do we have anybody on the phone? Any assembly members on the phone?
We have Randy Schultz here.
Okay, great. And then who else do we have with us today? If you want to go ahead and, for the since we don't have a video, make an audible introduction of who we have sitting at the table.
Craig Lyon, planning director.
Dean Gates is here too.
Okay.
Shooting private consultant.
Christine Bonnell, Long Range Planning Manager.
Daniel McKenna Foster, Long Range Planner.
Jim Weingarner with ACDA.
Excellent. Any other introductions? All right, excellent. All right, we're going to move right on. We don't have from unfinished business, since there's nothing on that. Unless there's someone, is there anything under unfinished business anybody would like to bring up? It doesn't have anything on the agenda, but we can address that now if necessary. Okay, moving on. I want to go to new business. At our last assembly meeting, AO 2023-42 came before us, amending the R4A in Title 21. And this came from the request of the planning department. And so what we do is we reverted it back to this committee for a little more in-depth conversation regarding what this is accomplishing, what would into it, so that we can discuss this prior to vote. Is there somebody from the planning department who's can speak to this ordinance?
Yeah, this is Daniel McKenna Foster, Long Range Planning. We're here. We have some slides if you want to go through the overview, or we just answer questions directly if anybody has any questions or discussion about that.
Why don't we go through your slides and see if they answer any of the questions or create any new ones, and then we'll have dialogue. Thank you.
So I guess as the projector's loading, I'll just start that the R4A district is sort of the highest capacity mixed-use district for the municipality at this point. It came out of the 2040 plan. It was an explicit sort of action item to put this together. It was put together a few years ago, but it hasn't seen a lot of use since then. So this project was really about trying to make the R4A a little more attractive to development. And hopefully meet the needs of the community and meet the needs of the plan. So another way to look at it is over the past few years, maybe past few decades, a lot of B3 is a very attractive zone because it allows a lot of flexibility, but in B3 we lose that residential potential. So R4A, a big part of it was trying to preserve that residential capacity, but also allow some of that flexibility. So this process has been going on since early 2022, and actually before that, but this is sort of the newest iteration of it. Yeah. This is just a quick timeline. And so we spent a lot of time talking to neighborhoods. I went to pretty much any neighborhood that was interested, any neighborhood that had land that was eligible. We talked a lot with Spenard because Spenard has one of the few areas that is actually zoned R4A. We went through planning and zoning. We've done a lot of internal meetings, and here we are in May 2023. So in general, this is kind of an overview map of where R4A could be eligible if somebody wanted to rezone into it. Again, right now there's just not that much R4A, but these are the areas that the plan allows. So this is an R4A area right now, and there's another little one over here. But it just hasn't been used as sort of a tool that's been in the toolbox that nobody's been picking up. So we're trying to make it so this is a tool that more people want to use. So a kind of bigger history of this piece is I mentioned a little bit about B3. The B3 history is a little more complex than that. So in Midtown's the center of the city. It'd be great to get more housing there. If you look at Midtown, the zoning there is kind of interesting, let's say, from a historical perspective, because there's B3 special limitations all over the place. And the special limitations say you have to do a site plan or you're limited to these uses. Some of them say you have to develop at a certain residential density. A lot of these were trying to control what was going on there to varying degrees of success. And here we have some R4A and here we have some R4A. So the point of this is really to emphasize that Midtown, as it was growing, was sort of losing a lot of residential capacity, and the Muni was kind of trying to do what it could to maintain that, sometimes through B3 SLs, but SLs, special limitations they add a level of complexity to zoning that kind of makes it a little more difficult to do things because you lose that standardized zoning. So what is the zone trying to do? Basically, when it was initially conceived, it was thought to be sort of to create this kind of district, something like you might see in Portland or any of those big growing cities. This is the classic 5/1, the sort of mixed-use development. So it was aiming for this. Here's another example from Minneapolis. You see these all over the country because it's kind of the nexus between affordable to build and meets the market need. Another thing, as we were going through this, is there was some other stuff we saw with lot sizes, and some people were uncomfortable with height. And so we looked at, well, if we can get the density that this zone wants, but we don't have to get it necessarily up, maybe there's another way to do it. So that was another big piece that we changed. So where's the zone allowed? As I mentioned, these are the areas where the comp plan allows it as an implementing zone. And that means if somebody wants to get into R4A, they still have to go through the rezone process. So again, there's very little R4A right now. It would be nice if that changed because it was such an attractive zone that people wanted to build in it, and they started building more housing. And so here are sort of the categories we just saw on that map. Comp plan support, remove desired barriers to infill, promote development of Main Street, transit-oriented mixed-use corridors, et cetera. So this has kind of gone through several iterations. The initial changes, update mixed-use standards, revise height allowances, simplify frontage standards, change access standards, change the allowances for commercial area, and add some uses that people thought were appropriate, stuff like cottage industry or maybe breweries. And I'll go through this fast because this has actually changed since over a year ago. So since then we went to planning and zoning. They wanted a little more feedback. We went back and we kind of talked to more people and we went through it. And really we tried to simplify it as much as we could. Because again, the purpose of this zone is to be more attractive than B3 and encourage that development that also requires some residential. So to do that, we have to make it easier and more attractive in certain ways. So try to do that by reducing complexity. So what are some of the top issues for the zone? Densities, facades and frontages, lot size, floor area ratio, heights and shadows. Densities, so already in the purpose statement of R4A, it calls for densities of 35 dwelling units per acre or more. So that was kind of our starting point. This is what the plan wants, this is what the Muni wants. We would love to see that much density. It helps for commercial activity, it helps for transit activity, it helps for all sorts of things. So just to kind of ground that, what does 35 dwelling units per acre look like? This is about 9 to 11 dwelling units per acre. This is about 15 to 17, this area right there. This is about 20 to 21. This is 20 to 22. So this is 43. So this is sort of what R4A imagines. But we also wanted to allow, any of this stuff too. So facades and frontages, there isn't much R4A. One of the only people who has R4A is working on a project right now in Spenard. And he actually told us about this project, which is very interesting because this is the kind of thing that I think a lot of people would envision, right? This is, I think it's somewhere near Seattle. And so thinking about, well, how did they get this and what matters in this situation? And a big discussion throughout the zone was, frontage standards are supposed to do what, right? It kind of depends who you ask. Some people say, they make it more walkable. Some people say they make it a nicer place to live. Throughout these discussions, the developer kept saying, we're required to do these frontage standards, but they're along streets that nobody wants to walk along. So we have to put all this cost in, and it doesn't make a huge difference. So this is actually a great example because here we have a nice building next to a private street that's really nice versus a public street, which is kind of designed to different ends, right? So looking back at this picture on the left and the right, we'll maintain that going forward. This is the kind of the image on the right, what it looks like on that private street, narrower lanes, more kind of street furniture, more lively stuff going on. And this is the stuff on the right, on that public street, right? This street is obviously designed for volume and flow. This street is designed for something else. So that was a big discussion through this project because the developer said, why do I have to have all these windows on a place where nobody's going to be? It's going to raise my costs. People are driving by, splashing, it's dirty, it's loud. And so we tried to balance that. And again, so this is actually some of the R4A land that exists now, and I think it's on this side as well. So as we're looking at that, it was hard to say that he didn't have a point, right? This road is not necessarily the friendliest place to walk on, and so the question is, well, even if you have a bunch of Van Gogh paintings on the side of the building here, does it make this more of a walkable street, right? So, of course, the facade frontage, everybody loves to hate downtown. This is kind of something that design standards can create. Whether it's successful or not is another question. So the proposal touches a lot of stuff, 210770, 210780, 2107-110. And so that's why when you look at the title, there seems to be so much going on. So lot size was another thing we were looking at. We were doing this while we were working on the downtown plan, and there was a lot going on, a lot of discussions, lot size there. We saw this, and really, we were trying to figure out, well, what problems it's trying to solve. And again, thinking back to this is supposed to be 35 dwelling units or more. We want flexibility. We want it to be more attractive than B3. So in the recommendation, we recommended kind of reducing these significantly and kind of consolidating in hopes that not only allows more flexibility for kind of a mixed use, but also would allow small lot density if that's what people want. Because it seems like that is maybe what the market wants, what people want to build, what they're comfortable building. So again, at 35 dwellings per acre, which is already in code, that was already kind of the goal set here. So just looking at that, if you said, okay, we want at least 35 dwellings per acre, and you divide that out from how many square feet in an acre, you get a lot size of about 1,244 square feet. So this is kind of showing our math with how we got to those lower lot sizes.
But that's not exactly true, is it? Like if you go back, you have to have a way to move people throughout your lot. So if you're talking about individual small lots divided into an acre, you would have to have access, and so that would be subtracted from your 43,560, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's a great point. You're always going to have roads, alleys,
Right,
other
and so
stuff.
your net is going to be, if you were going to 35 individual lots, like 800 or so, maybe, this is a rough guess, maybe a little bit larger, that gets pretty small for a lot.
Right.
And so maybe we need to factor that in so people understand. It's hard to dive in, but.
No, that's a good point. What do we normally factor in 30%? It depends on the development.
Yeah,
Road sidewalks.
Anyhow, just that's a consideration. It doesn't make sense to me.
that's a great point. This is based off pure 43,560 square feet in an acre. If you go, divide that out to get the density, whatever you're putting out, you have to put in roads, you have to put in access. That changes the density of what's going on.
Right, just because if you're talking about a small lot, you can't have a small lot of 1,200 square feet out of 35 in 1 acre. It just matters.
Well, and the other thing too is the subdivision code also limits how small you can go in any case.
Right, so but if the goal here is to move towards small lots of this size so people can do this in this way, I can imagine like tiny houses with 3 stories, so you have 2 units, maybe you could achieve it, but it would take a lot of change.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's a great point. I'm glad you brought it up. So I think in the final proposal, but we did end up reducing that lot size. Maybe that could be reduced or changed accordingly, according to, if you want to include that 30% for site access, that sort of thing. Another piece that was kind of in the zone already is floor area ratio, which I don't know about you, but I always kind of have to draw it out and figure out what it is again. Floor area ratio is sort of regulating the volume of a building, how much it can be on a lot. Sometimes some cities, instead of using setbacks or height, they'll just do floor area ratio because it limits how much can be on there. So if you have 2 FAR, it means if you have a 100 by 100 square foot lot, 10,000 square feet, you can basically build 2 cubes worth. The floor area ratio, you can build twice as much. And you can build that all at once, or you can kind of move it around in this way. If you have 1, you can only fill up the whole lot. Must be a timer on here. Or you can do it kind of in this way. And just having floor area ratio is always going to limit both heights and coverage, but we also have setbacks and we also have height limits as well. So in the R4A, previously there were the FAR ratios were in one section for both R4 and R4A. We also tried to separate that out just to make it a little bit clearer. And currently you're allowed to get 3 FAR through bonuses. In a lot of our research, we found that nobody really uses the bonuses and they aren't really effective. So we allowed up to 4 FAR just in the proposal. Because the thinking is, if the municipality is okay with that level, then why not just allow it in the first place, right? Heights, shadows, heights, this was a big discussion. throughout the years we were working on it. I think we actually lowered the base height, but we allowed a higher height with admin site plan review. So this is just looking at actually the only site that has R4A right now, looking what's currently allowed if they built there, and how it shadows on March 24th and 130. In December, a fire hydrant casts a shadow that's 100 feet long, basically, in December. So we did look at that. We had a lot of comments about that, but we reduced the permitted kind of by right height actually, but we allowed higher height with admin site plan review, hoping that would kind of deal with anything that came up. And then again, here's the existing R2M next to R4A, also shadows with the existing height. So we live in a city, buildings cast shadows, trees cast shadows, but it's kind of the way things go. So thank you. Anybody have any questions or comments? I'd love to address those.
I have a question. Because I see some references to site plan review, which I understand is, things like increasing. But I'm looking at it, so it looks like more things were made basically permitted, right? I'm just trying to sort out like what is allowed by right, like how much can you do with this versus having to go and ask for additional permission basically at the zoning level.
Yeah, we did add uses. And a lot of those had been added previous to 2022 in the initial proposal.
Okay.
But it was really thinking about if we want this to be a mixed-use zone, let's allow as much potential stuff as possible. So that hopefully somebody can make it work. And another piece too was mixing uses horizontally and vertically. So you can have two buildings on the same lot that are different uses, whereas I think previously that wasn't allowed. So you could either have it, the first floor is retail and the top floors are residential, or you have a little, your residential building and then your commercial activity in a separate building. Just because I think when this was put together, it was sort of the heyday of the 501s in Portland. And I honestly don't know if those get built anymore. I don't know if that's a popular product or what. So it was really trying to get to that. So if somebody wants to mix use and it makes more sense to do it in different buildings and they can phase it in a way, then great, that would work.
Okay. And I know that's how, different type of zoning or zone, but Rustic Oat is that way, to my understanding. There's
Right.
the restaurant and then there's the apartments.
Exactly.
On the side.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm just flagging what's permitted by right versus what needs additional review, just because that adds to the cost and the time too. So it's helpful to see, what you can just do without having to go through those extra processes if you want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Gunn?
Thank you. I have a small handful of questions. So your slide deck is helpful. When I look at the slide 4, which is the one that shows the pink that is where these zones might be allowed, what factors make it in those zones allowable? Or is not zones, areas? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the map you're
Yeah,
referring to.
and so like you have identified a handful of lots or properties in the pink. What makes them eligible,
This is based off the 2040 plan,
right?
and wherever they said that R4 is eligible. So whenever they were putting that together in 2017, however they determined that these areas were appropriate for some of this higher density stuff.
So classification of roadway, access to transit, that's good.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, and maybe compared with existing stock and what, I don't know. It's interesting. Then, okay, thank you. So it was the 2040 plan. Then, skipping pretty far back, I think it's to your slide 29.
One of these.
Yeah, it's fine. On the right of the building, there it is. You talked about how this makes changes relative to concerns from the developers that they didn't want to add elements on the main feeder road there on the right because it's not a friendly walkable street. And so what is the net change that's being proposed here that would make a difference on that side of the property? What does it look like?
Well, we tried to simplify the facade standards in general. I'm sorry that it seems to be on a timer, but just because the developer's saying it would be really expensive to put all this glass and all this stuff on, maybe it's 36th, where if the purpose is it's a pedestrian-oriented frontage and it's supposed to encourage walkability, yet the reality is that no matter what you put here, it doesn't really change what's in the right of way. And so
Here's the problem, right? So now I understand is that's most of Anchorage. is fronted by all of these streets in every direction. And so if the argument is, let's not have standards for walkability and usability and beautification because it's not really gonna be used, that's everywhere. Because there really aren't places with those lovely internal roads. And then, yeah, go back to that slide. That was my next slide. This one, that one. I mean, that's like the perfect example of abusing the code that we have. What the developer's gonna do is not even put in those fake window frames, which the code required at the time, to make it a street front use. And so instead, what you got on the other side is that big parking lot, which does nothing for improvement to the neighborhood. It's just a detriment. The whole purpose of that section of the code was to require some actual frontage to make the streets less hostile. And of course, this builder just found a workaround, faked it. And so they didn't actually do anything to approve it, but what it sounds like then the plan is just to eliminate the requirement. So on this side, they could practically just have a cement wall because it's a main thoroughfare.
Well, we didn't eliminate the frontage requirements, but this came out of a larger question of what makes the street walkable and who bears the responsibility for that. And it's true, like this, even with those design or even with those all windows, does that make that street more walkable? And that's the intent of making these.
Well, the theory was have doors there, have your access there so that people would actually use it to get in. But of course, these folks proved there's nothing we were going to be able to do with the code to make that happen. They were going to do what they wanted, and that's because it was parking oriented altogether. That's it. And of course, that building soon is going to be empty because that is not a successful or thriving business. And so what we're going to have there is a big cement box that doesn't do anything and just detracts from the community. And now it sounds like we're arguing, let's make it even less hospitable on the street. So, and I'm curious, finally, to the slide that's 31 there, the previous slide one. That's Jay Brooks' property. I saw his name on one of the projects. Is this something that we're doing effectively based on his input? And is he one of the stronger voices in this?
So, J.J. Brooks is one of the few people on this property that is zoned R4A. We did talk with him a lot, but we didn't want to get stuck creating a zone for one person, right? Because that's just, it's not going to work. So there's a lot of stuff in here that he didn't like. For example, he said you can't have a parking lot between a building and the street because that's one of the main things that if you want a real kind of city urban environment, you just can't have that, right? And there was a lot of, ultimately it's decided by the Planning and Zoning Commission, it's decided by you all. But we tried to talk to every neighborhood that might be able to do this. We tried to talk to anybody who might develop into it. We spent a lot of time talking with Spinard. And I know Spinard and J.J. Brooks have spent a lot of time talking together. Last summer we met with Lindsay Haidu, who was, I don't know, I think she was the head of the land use committee at that point, and J.J. Brooks, and just talk. Because for us, it's kind of like, can we figure out something that you all want that also meets the needs of the plan? And so we worked a lot with J.J. Brooks, but we were really sensitive to that. We don't want this to become a very highly specific thing.
Right, so step back to the previous question. I would love to have some kind of a statement that helps to summarize these changes on the thoroughfares that are reductions in required amenities or improvements. Right. Again, my fear is a big cement wall along every road we have in Anchorage in these R4A districts, because that's all we have are these big cement roads. We don't have big open spaces that can be cultivated into nice internal roads that have the left side of that. Maybe there can be some of that, especially around the Chugach area and the Cook Inlet projects with the tax abatements there, because there is a lot of land. But for the most part, and it doesn't abut main roads like this, most of our land is somewhere on this grid.
I'm trying to look at, and there's a piece of this in with large commercial establishments at 2107, 120, it's page 17 and 19 of the AO, when a lot of the standards still exist. A lot of the standards for multifamily still apply. I just need to double check that. But it doesn't allow somebody to just build that concrete wall. But honestly, that was sort of an unresolved, out of this, it really came out of it. We've had all these design standards, and if you see in R4 and the previous R4A, there were pretty restrictive design standards, and we got nobody building, nobody using it, and nobody willing to take the risk to rezone into R4A. Because why would you, right? If you can get to B3, you can get a number of units you want, plus all the flexibility. So it was tough, and another thing that I didn't mention, I should have mentioned explicitly, R4A requires residential development. So that's sort of the piece, is this zone is making that trade and saying, we really need residential density. And as a result of that, you get higher flexibility. But I don't think you could just build a straight wall without any windows or anything like that. But it just doesn't heighten some of those frontage standards. Like the current R4A is a little more complex in that way. So, I mean, you've identified the problem, and my response is that, well, we have a problem with rights of way. We have a problem with, do frontages actually make things more walkable, or do we need to address the right of way problem? And what are we willing to give up to make this more attractive for residential development?
So, and I'll finish here with one last commentary, that I see all of this very aggressive conversation about density and get rid of zones and make it so people can build. And I just remember the site condo problem in Anchorage, where we did that before a lot of us were on the scene. And we got to the point where we were building them up and tight and doing exactly what a lot of these things promised to do, but we found that there were major safety problems and development problems and other issues that came that sparked this revision to Title 21. And so I'm afraid that we may cantilever back so hard, or slingshot back so hard in an effort to get to some ideal unit count, that we actually fail. And we get back to the gulag approach of development, where we're going to look like a post-Soviet community because we eliminate all of the actual amenities that we've been trying to get people to participate in. And so there's a tension there for me that is unresolved internally of how are we going to square that? Because I don't want a Soviet community where we pour concrete, use digital printing, and have buildings that all look the same. And anyhow, so I'm struggling with a lot of this stuff.
I'll just make one final comment, and I apologize, I couldn't find this before. It's on page 10 of 12 of the AO. Section 2, existing requirements for multifamily development outlined in 2107 and still apply. So the design standards in 2107 do still apply, those basic ones. It really just doesn't add new ones, or it takes away the more complicated ones that were in the existing R4A. So if there's a problem with the existing, then that's one thing. But this,
okay, so I guess follow-up out of this meeting would be, can we get like a table of the things that will no longer be required? Just a little detail. Yeah, just a snapshot. That might go a long ways to alleviating my concern.
definitely.
Before moving on, I wanted to acknowledge that we're joined by members Bronga and member Brawl.
Yeah, I guess a follow-up comment to what Chris was saying, if you can go to slide 32. Sorry, just down to the next slide. Yeah, Chris, I hear what you're saying, and it is interesting to think about what is the responsibility of the right, like, how wide the sidewalk is and other kind of pieces like that. Should there be a light pole in the middle of the sidewalk, that kind of thing. But it does occur to me that that it is valuable to have buildings that go up to the street, because if you look at the other side, that is an office. It looks like an office building. I'm trying to remember what exactly is over there. So in theory, and then the alternative too is you see on the other side of that block on the right, there's an open parking lot, and I think Daniel made a good point, which is that you don't want parking lots in the front. So in some sense, it's a success and a failure of the code, this particular office.
Well, the parking,
Supply
I
place.
jump in there, is on the other side. So it's a narrow road, and the reality is it does exactly what you don't want it to do on the other side. It doesn't achieve what you want on this side.
Yeah.
But that's the whole mission, was get buildings open on the street so that people use the street to go into the businesses and become more walkable.
Yeah. No, and I'm torn too, because as a planner, I like the idea of having a bunch of standards and saying this is exactly what we want it to look like. And then the flip side is, right now what we have is our code is difficult to use, and for various reasons we're not building a lot of things, and so something is broken. So I don't know what the right answer is, but that is a challenge.
Thank you. And just remember, we're on audio, so if you
Oh, yeah.
want to step in, make sure you give your name. so
Okay,
that
thanks.
it's
Sorry, that was
recording.
Anna.
No, this is Kevin Cross. It's interesting you mentioned this because we ran the design standard issue when they were doing the Walgreens in Eagle River, and that there's a little annex building out in front that they specifically, the only reason they built it was because they couldn't have their parking lot facing the street, but where the building needed to set in order for it to function, so they literally just built a 1,200 square foot office building, or I think it's, 1,500 square foot office building intentionally on the corner just so they can meet that design criteria, and then they just lease it out. And so it's interesting, they actually just created an office building with they didn't need it. I don't know if they even cared if it sat empty, but that was what they needed in order to build the Walgreens, in order to create that separation. And I guess my question for this is, now, a couple of years ago, we made changes we came up with an R3 SL, which allowed for mixed use, okay, which is a combination of residential as well as commercial, okay? And it sounds to me like this brings this really close to being similar to the R3 SL that we came with, and I don't know if the SL is right, but do you know what I'm talking about? It was an R3 designation that we changed, I want to say about 3 or 4 years ago, that allows for mixed use on R3. And I guess my question is between those two, because there's a lot more of that out there, but now allows for commercial use. And I'm kind of curious on what those differences are, because wouldn't it be easier, I don't know, or maybe it's not easier just to refer to, if the design standards and the density criteria are almost identical between the two zonings, if there isn't more of a uniformity.
This is Daniel, McKenna Foster Long Range Planning. I maybe would defer to current planning on that. Maybe it's R3M. Is that the one that was the R3 mixed use?
We were just discussing something else. What was the property?
So there was a new land use that was passed, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago, before I was on the assembly, but it's a mixed use on R3.
R3A.
R3A.
R3A, which sounds a lot like what we're talking about here.
It's a lower density mixed use district. So the R3A is intended to be kind of that medium density residential with commercial.
Yeah.
The R4A is intended to be the high density with commercial.
So on the R3A, one of the issues that, and you can correct me if this is inaccurate information, this is just what I've heard from developers, is that you can't build the commercial until you develop the residential, and so there is a balance, because I can't remember, it's a 50-50 ratio. Does that apply to the R4? Is there a stipulation that you cannot build any of the commercial out until you build the residential first?
That actually, Dave Whitfield with current planning. Yeah, that's one of the challenges, Mr. Cross, that we ran into with these mixed use developments. And Daniel, I think you mentioned this. One of the challenges for a project to pencil is to get that commercial. And if you have to build the residential in advance of that commercial, how do you make the project pencil, right? So that was one of the challenges we looked at. I don't know that we've necessarily solved it. These are residential districts.
Yes.
They're intended to be residential but allow for commercial. So how do you balance that to ensure that you still get the residential, knowing that in order for a project to pencil, you need that commercial?
So in the R3A, it says that 33% of the square footage in the R3A is allowed to be non-residential, such as commercial. And the timing of when you have to start building the residential is that you shall not receive a certificate of occupancy or a conditional certificate of occupancy until a proportionate share of residential units meeting the requirement have received their conditional certificate of occupancy. Right. So the timing, the way that Dave explained it. And in the R4A that Daniel can answer, there must be a timing standard in there somewhere.
I guess I shouldn't say fear, but the issue that we're running into is if we allow the commercial without the residential, then is there a possibility that we'll have all the commercial with no residential?
Yeah. Well, and I guess my question is, when I'm looking at these buildings where you have commercial down low and the residential up high, what you're saying is until a residential is built out equal to or greater than the square footage, you can't utilize any of the commercial space, even though it may have been completed.
Well, I mean, what you're referring to, and Dave Whitfield, again, current planning, is vertical mixed use. The district allows for horizontal mixed use as well, so you can have a separate building dedicated all to commercial, and then another building dedicated to residential,
Like Rustic Go.
like Rustic Oak.
Yes, and so the thought is the provision and the limitation prevent abuse of horizontal mixed use, unintentionally putting restrictions on vertical mixed use because of that CO requirement.
Well, I think actually you might be onto something there, Kevin. If it were vertical mixed use, perhaps you found a way to, because I don't think a developer is going to do vertical mixed use with commercial and not do the residential. They could certainly do that with horizontal, but I think it's less likely that you'd see that with a vertical mixed use project.
Daniel and then Chris.
This is Daniel McKim-Foster, Long Range Planning. Just for reference, on page 4 of 19 of the AO 2, it says the overall development site shall include at least 20 dwelling units per acre at the completion of all phases, unless provided otherwise for a major site plan review, conditional use process, small area implementation plan. And then on page 9 of 19, it talks about the timing. It says timing set by the decision of the director or through a small area implementation plan, prior issuance to any CO or CCO. Development must meet the minimum housing requirement, meet the maximum allowed proportional share of non-residential use. So just for referencing this, those are the timing standards we're talking about.
Chris?
Thank you. My experience in watching these kind of projects start to emerge is the commercial is the last one that builders and developers go to because it's expensive to get the business and they don't generally have the tenants lined up in advance. And so I'm curious to see how that interplays with the actual reality on the ground. Because what I've seen is the opposite, that they're not constrained by the commercial. It's actually been a hurdle for them that's been harder to overcome. They get the housing done first.
Well, I can name specifically a project that isn't being built because of the residential requirement first.
Yeah, that's good. So we should look at that as an area of interest because it definitely is unusual.
Yeah, there's a lot on the corner of Arlene and Diamond, 6.5 acres that was redone. And it allows for mixed use. And they have interest in that building for doing some small medical office buildings right across from Skinny Raven. So they had some people express and doing like a chiropractic stuff because you've got Skinny Raven, you've got that. There's not a medical district over there, but they haven't finished the design on the residential yet because they're not sure about the density, and so they haven't done anything with the land. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Cross. Dave Whitfield, again, current planning. That's specifically the project that I think of when we talk about a proposed mixed-use project. In working with developers on that project, one of the things that they brought to light was the need for that commercial in order to make the residential rental. So when we talk about the challenges with the R3A or R4A, I automatically go back to that project and the conversations we had with the development team there and trying to figure out how to overcome those challenges.
Thank you. Any other questions? Daniel, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Thank you. Thank you for the clarification. And so just in closing, looks like we ended just requesting a summary sheet on the limitations that have been eliminated, I guess, through Mr. Constance. Thank you. All right, I'll go back to my agenda. Okay, we're going to move on to the draft AO regarding alcohol license process cleanup. Who's in charge of that presentation? Excellent, Mandy.
Mandy Honest, Municipal Clerk's Office. I'm the business license official. This project has been worked on for a number of years actually and put on the back burner through COVID and was picked up again recently. So it's kind of a overall cleanup and reorganization of our current code. It deals with Title II, that's the assembly processes for their quasi-judicial review of alcohol licenses, and then Title X, which is the licensing portion that regulates the clerk's office, our review process, the department reviews, and then regulation with APD monitoring, and the clerk's office monitoring as well. So overall, there is not any changes that are substantial to the content. It really is reorganization and clarification. And so I can kind of start with you on page 2. If you look at section 2, what we did was the original 230 was a bunch of chunk paragraphs of the assembly's processes. There was a little bit of direction for the clerk's office for noticing requirements. So what we did was separated out what was the assembly's duties versus what is the clerk's duties, and pulled the clerk's duties under Title 10 where they should be. The assembly's duties stayed under Title 2 and reorganized. So we added definitions. That'll be the first thing you see. We didn't have definitions prior, so this is new. There's a lot of things that we've done procedurally and that we've done because of requirements from the state that haven't really been codified. And so we're just trying to add a lot of that in for clarification now. Some of our practices, like the conditional protests that we do so regularly, we're adding a definition in for that. And then section 230.
Hold on, do we want to know questions as we go, or
I can do either, whichever you
Chris,
prefer.
did you have a question?
I do.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair. So it's hard to tell what's new language, what's moved language effectively, because it all, in terms of the drafting format, it all looks like it's existing language. And so that's one issue that I'm kind of struggling with understanding specifically what's changing. But this definition, licensed premises, is this a new definition?
Yes.
And so any adjacent area, does that take into account the new processes that have been established that allow for parking lots and sidewalk, cafes and parking spaces that have to cross small, non-adjacent municipal rights-of-way?
So that is a very good question. That actually did not cross my mind when we were taking this. Any adjacent area was taken from a different portion of code that my understanding dealt with concerns of like package stores that had trash and issues surrounding their licensed premises, but wasn't technically part of their licensed premises, so they were not taking action to remedy that. But that is a very good question, and I didn't think about that. Maybe Anna.
Yeah, this is Anna. I can answer that too. I think the key language is any adjacent area under the control or management of the licensee. So I think it could, for example, the language could say something like including public rights of way, or some of the language that's been included in outdoor dining or outdoor premises. But it also, just as an example, can include, I'm going to use an example of the Glacier Brew House in Orso. And so that's actually attached to the same license. There's a duplicate license across a hallway. So there are situations where there can be basically unlicensed premises between two different licensed premises. So that would also contemplate, that maybe that they're renting the whole space, or there's like I said, a hallway or another room. So it could be broad, but I think it could address that.
I think the change I would make is to strike the word adjacent. So it's any area under the control or management of the licensee, right? Because then you have whatever barriers might be between. Right.
And that would extend out if they permanently do a sidewalk permit, they
Because
control
they
that.
have the control.
Yeah, they would have control of it.
It raises a couple more questions, like under the definition of licensed premises, what if someone has multiple licenses? Does that create a scenario where we're looking at each of their separate licenses as one because they're licensee? But I think that's more attenuated than the specific issue I brought up. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I can respond to that too, Chris, I think, this is Anna again. I think also if there's multiple licenses, then you would also be looking at different licensing applications, right? So they might be coming together, like let's say a brewery that now owns a restaurant or something like that. So either they're applying for them together, or maybe the license on the table at the moment is just the one. So I think it kind of depends on what the
Right, because what comes to mind is the 49th state. They have their licensed premises, and within that footprint of that licensed premises, they have a dispensary. And it's a full licensed dispensary, not just the beer and wine license, not just their products. And so it's confusing and complex, and I just wonder if that definition is quite right, but we're early in the process.
No, and I also, to add on to that, Chris, because you make a good point, is what about a business owner who then buys an adjacent lot for additional parking? Or across the street for additional parking, which I think happened at Spenard, Little Max, they bought a lot across, which means it's not adjacent, but it's under our control, so then remove that word adjacent. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr.
Dave
Cross.
Whitfield?
I appreciate the question, Mr. Constant. I think the question here is, so we have, in Title 21, we have two separate definitions of abutting and adjacent. I actually think adjacent works here from an implementation standpoint. However, if it is the desire of the assembly to remove the term adjacent, I think that works as well.
So, Mr. Constant here, the only thing that really strikes me is we had to fight with the state to get them on board to agree to using the sidewalks and using the parking lots, because their definition of adjacent was connected, like you can't cross a separate piece of public right-of-way, otherwise it's not allowable, right? So they had to go through a huge process. So maybe what we need to do briefly, of course, is compare these definitions, the state and the muni for adjacent versus abutting, and see if there's a crosswalk there.
It sounds like they use the term adjacent the same way that we would use the term abutting.
Right.
Anna?
Yeah, this is Anna. I think, so general context, the state is actively working on regulations to basically implement this giant set of law changes. Two of the things that have come up is literally discussion about the word adjacent. We had a meeting that was like an hour long, and that was half of it. And then the other one is that there's active work on regulations as far as overlapping premises. So that's also the situation you're talking about with 49th State, or two businesses that go in on a joint venture. There's going to be all kinds of situations that will apply to, and they are actively discussing, for example, who's liable if a violation happens? Does every license get so there's a lot of other issues that are being actively discussed. So I would say I'm fine with taking out the word adjacent, or like Dave said, it is relatively more broad, but we should look at the state definitions, and some of this stuff won't get, they'll put out drafts and it won't get figured out for a while, but we can also come back to it, because again, my intent is there are policy discussions to be had and more changes to be made beyond these, and so I think, anyway, it could come up again.
Mr. Gates?
Yeah, thank you. The term adjacent and abutting, they're really legal terms of our property law, right, and land use law. And if they're not defined, we look at Black's Law Dictionary as to what they mean. But we do have definitions of both those words in Title 21. And I think this is more a Title 21 question than the licensed premises question. And I think we would be relying on those two definitions in Title 21. I'm going to read them out here. I have them in front of me. Abutting means touching or bordering, and it says, see illustration under adjacent. So it sounds kind of synonymous, I think, from your experience, perhaps. And adjacent is abutting or across, this is abutting or across an alley, a street, public or private, local and collective classification on the official streets and highways plan, a biggest joint right of way with a drawing, and which is, I think, like Mr. Constant described, it's across the roadway, but the state, I guess, maybe see it differently. What makes sense to me, I guess, is this is Title 21, and licensed premises is sort of a different creature, although there's a lot of overlap. And we just, I think, want to make sure that that it all meshes together. And I think that's what Mandy and Ms. Ennis have been trying to do. So I don't know, Ms. Honest, I think there needs to be some change there. More adjacent. Yeah, that's helpful.
So just for clarification, are you recommending leaving adjacent in, or are you recommending removing it?
Well, I'm not quite sure myself actually, but we're just asking, should we define it or something? We already have a definition and we already have a meaning and how it's applied and how it's applied by the state. I still need to look at whether those are sort of similar, synonymous, or if they're defined differently. And, so that's sort of like our task list.
Thank you.
And just, this Christopher, I'll just conclude to say that this is literally the definition of licensed premises in Title 21. So it's the cross-reference between the two kind of definitions. But if adjacent is defined in the code, I think I'm comfortable with it. We just may have to fight that with the state at some point again, but they were persuaded after a lot of sturm and drang to come around to our definition. And so it might be moot. I just wanted to be clear, but since it's defined, I'm actually okay with it.
And this is Anna. There is a draft regulation that I think is out for comment on that, basically the issue of outdoor dining in adjacent areas. So we could look at that too.
1 second.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chris Schutte. I just wanted to offer that since Dean made a reference to Title 21, which is the best section of code to always reference, there is a great definition that we created, that you all created a year or two ago as it relates to outside dining and the licensed premises being expanded. I'd like to read it because I think it's actually a good substitute. It says, contiguous to or directly adjacent to existing licensed premises when the temporary licensed premises include public rights-of-way subject to obtaining the corresponding right-of-way permit, blah, blah, blah. But it very clearly says we're talking about adjacency can apply even if you have to cross the sidewalk. And that came out of 2103-040 Section D when it's talking about temporary outdoor use permits, which I think is the primary issue that both Assemblymember Constant and Brawley are talking about. So just if you want to steal some language from somewhere else.
Bruce?
Yeah, thanks. Kevin, your example of the parking lot, they had to buy a parking lot, I forget where that property was. It might be slightly different than that licensed premises conversation in the context of this, because this, I think, is trying to get to even your parking, all of the things that are related to your business are part of your premises. And so not just the place you're licensed to serve. I think maybe that's the thrust of this line. It's like the places you're in control of, you have to manage. But I don't know. So we'll go through it and come back to this. It's just flagged, I guess.
This is Mandy Honest with the clerk's office. Like I said, this was some language that was taken out of current Title 10, and it was under some of the, I believe it was under operations originally, and we moved it to definitions. And so one thing to keep in mind with the Title 10 licenses is these are kind of geared towards consumer protection and public safety. And so with that in mind, that's kind of the tone for a lot of the language. And of course, we are wanting to make things easier on the licensees and applicants as well, clarify, make sure that they're protected because they have clear language that they can understand. But that's kind of overall the assembly over the years has directed licenses to the clerk's office to issue based off of consumer protection and public safety. So I'm not attached to the definition. Like I said, it's something that I took from somewhere else. I'm happy to change it.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that.
And if I may, Chris, to your other question about the drafting, this was something that DNS decided would be easier because it would be more readable, is to repeal everything and make it all new language. So that's why it appears this way, is because it is all new.
Right, absolutely, if I might, Mr. Chair. I think that's a dilemma because people can't see what's changing, and I hate to do make work. Sometimes we do tables that are the changes. So just, right, so I think Dee probably has a track changes version that can show what elements were changed. But I recognize, again, your predicate to all of this is that these aren't substantial changes. This is a reorganization so that when we come back to do substantial changes, they're based on a well laid out code. And so for the most part, I'm guessing it's not a lot, but I know members often wonder when you read it like this, what's changing? Because our attention span is looking for a specific format.
Mr. Gates?
Oh, thank you. Well, I was going to mention one more thing about the definition, but first I wanted to say it sounds like Mr. Constance is asking for a crosswalk sort of table for what's changed. And then back to that definition of licensed premises, what makes sense to me is so that we have less confusion for the licensees and the operators. And between, alcohol regulation is all patchwork. And I think that it's better if we use some consistency of terms. So licensed premises by the state, as I recall, it just means where the liquor is allowed to be sold, that's the premises. It's not adjacent areas, little hallways and stuff where it can't be sold. And so I would modify this definition of licensed premises, means what it says in state law. And then a different word, I don't know, the licensee's property or something, and I'm just thinking out loud, which I don't really like to do so much in meetings, but another term, licensee's property or something, which means the licensed premises and adjacent property, this definition there. And so I would just separate them out that way. I think that would be, I guess, a little cleaner when we're trying to get all the different patchwork of regulation we have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts, comments? Thank you. All right, so in closing, we just had a couple things just to make sure. I like to wrap everything up and say what's happened next. Mr. Constant had requested that it's edited to make sure it's clear and it's consistent with our standard AO format, which is proper underlines and designations of what's new and what's changed.
A crosswalk, so a separate document that shows the changes, and they have it, so we'll be receiving that. I don't want them to go back in and make the changes in this document, but provide for us a tool so you can understand.
Like an AM.
Similar.
All right, fantastic.
Yeah, and we have an AM that is being worked on and will be included with it to talk about this as well. But yeah, we have the crosswalk that goes through, and basically it's a graph that shows section, what the title is, what has changed, and then any notes. And so we kind of go through line by line, section by section, and show specifically what that was, if something was moved, where it was moved to. So it does designate all of that information out.
Excellent, thank you. All right, go back to our agenda. All right, as we're wrapping up here, do we have anybody on the line, any audience participation?
Are we done with time?
What's that?
Are we out of time?
No, we have 30 minutes. We're ahead of schedule.
Yeah, because there's a whole bunch more to go through.
Oh, is there? Okay, go keep going.
We just got the first.
That was the first one.
Like the first section, first line.
Oh, yeah, you're still doing your presentation.
They just got
That was
started.
easy.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, before we go on, can I ask an overarching question to Mandy? You've enumerated section 230, 120, 130, and 135 as being repealed. Are you leaving 125 untouched?
I believe so. There was some sections that we've kind of discussed as either being okay the way they are, or they're going to be policy questions, and there will be a follow-up ordinance that will be more of those policy questions. So this one is specifically just cleaning up the regular processes and procedures of the clerk's office and the assembly for licenses. And then some of those other ones like that may be dealt with in the other AO.
So come back to 125 and deal with the protests, the process for protests later?
125. We did put, so protest became part of 23122. So it's part of the assembly review and action on state alcohol license applications. Is that the portion that you're asking about? So
I'm just wondering if this ordinance will speak to the criteria enumerated in 230-125 current code dealing with protesting.
Look at 124.
It does.
In the draft.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it should also
Yes.
be repealed as well.
yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so
123 is that.
that's,
But yeah, they just didn't list one point
I
five
see
in
what you're
the
saying.
section one.
Got it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so yes, 230-122, this is the Assembly's procedures. Like I said, this is all stuff that you guys already do. It's just, we're making it kind of more cookbook style. So this is step-by-step how you would go about your process in a little bit more of a step-by-step fashion. So first of all, we wanted to do kind of a definition and set the tone for the Assembly's authority on the licenses. The state has given local governments jurisdiction over licenses within their premises. And so the Assembly has a lot of authority over what they will allow with licenses. And so that's kind of this initial introductory paragraph is just setting that the Assembly has a lot of authority over actions on licenses.
Question, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Costa here. So your lines 2 and 3 on the third page there. I understand that basically this section is referencing state law because it says is authorized by the state too. And then back here, it's the protest shall be upheld by the Alcohol Beverage Control Board unless it is found to be arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable. That's not a code standard, that's a law standard, right? And so basically this section is taking its authority from that one line that says authorized by the state. Okay. Then the second question to that is, have you had a chance to think through all of this after the recent protest process that we went through? You've had a chance, and have you had any thoughts on how this might change, or is this a product of that?
This has elements to it. So the very standard protests and the ones that are guided by our historic code is in here. So the waive of protest, if there's no issues, the protest, we pulled out conditional protest, recommended conditions, protest of continued operation, and then protest of the application. So we kind of tried to segment them out into the specific types of protests that the Assembly has the ability to do. I will say alcohol is very fluid. They're so individual with their cases, they're so individual with the issues and the potential solutions. And I found we've been able to, over the years, get a general process for some of these weird ones, but really it's hard to codify something to capture
Every process.
right.
So if I might, then, just as a matter of context, we had a protest that went on for the better part of a year, and it was difficult, and it took attorneys, and it went through many cases, and AMCO didn't believe we had a thoughtful and thorough process because the presentation made by the licensee who we were protesting, they believed him, until after they had seen him in action, and then they realized that he wasn't quite the most honest individual. But there were many questions pointing to our code, saying this isn't clear. And so the timing of this is good to clarify some of that. And so that's where those questions are coming for. Did we do a post-process analysis of this code to make sure we try to clarify it? What I'm hearing is it's complex because every situation is different. So what that raises the question of maybe we should contemplate like a brief description before all of the definitions of the various protests that outlines our methodology or the way we look at this, that gives people a brief roadmap to understand those sections and how that might work. So we can talk about that a little bit, and that could be for the next go around as well. But some preamble to the protest process. And one thing you'll learn as new members is that new licensees come forward with an application and they see this document called a conditional protest. And almost universally it gives them a heart attack because they believe that's a protest of their license, but it's actually not. And so what it is we have conditions that need to be met before the clerk is delegated to authorize your license. But that doesn't communicate to the person who spent the last 3 years trying to figure out a business and they're before you and they hear the word protest. And so all of this is a way of saying this section is really important, and we might want to put some buffer language at the top that helps people to understand how this section works. But we can talk about that later.
At this, and this is Mandy, at this point we did do efforts into kind of describing the different types. So if you look at page 3, line 42, it starts with the protests. We have little blurbs under A, B, C, and D that kind of go into some details about what the protest type is and what it does. But that's definitely not limited to that. We can add to it and clarify.
And then what I think is a little paragraph that describes protests include a variety of things to either provide the staff an opportunity to clarify things or for a more substantive protest. And maybe that isn't proper for the code, but we should talk about that some more.
And I think, yeah, and I think a lot of that kind of stuff is stuff that we've worked with, like Dean, to try and address in the AR templates. So the resolution templates we've tried to set up as formats where they have those check boxes. And that's, I think, maybe a better route to go about, maybe work on those a little bit more.
In the resolution template, how it works.
And then that way we can clarify that language there.
Thanks.
This is Anna, just to add to, I think some other parts of this document may address some of what you're bringing up, so I think it might be helpful to keep going through and then just see what's missing.
So one of the things that we did was pull out the things that are required for public hearings, so made that kind of an easier section. So any of the protests require the public hearing. That's a requirement the state has. We, as local governments, if we are going to protest, have to offer the applicant an opportunity to be heard. So we fulfill that by setting public hearings. Public hearing itself isn't required by state. It's just an opportunity to be heard, but this is the easiest way for us to do it. So we've done the public hearings, pulled it out, made it a whole section. That's number 3. And then on page 4, starting at 18, these are your standards for reviewing the license applications. This is, again, the same standards that you've had currently. We just cleaned it up a little bit, pulled it out of giant paragraphs that it currently was in, made it a little bit more readable. These are just, well, no, one of the things that we added, line 24, was the general requirements. That's something you've been doing, but we wanted to codify it. So do they actually have everything that they need? And this is your conditional protest. So we added this to address the conditional protest. Do they have all of their certifications of compliance for reviews? And so that'll be one of your criteria to review. If not, that's the conditional protest. And then the rest of them go into public comments. You weigh the public comments received from your community, the community councils, and then the regular taxes, fees, fines, land use. And so those ones are all listed there. That's what it's been before, other than the 2 I mentioned. Page 5, line 31, these are the standards governing the protests. So this kind of goes a little bit more into detail of the process for protesting. We have your concentration and land use, the operations, and these are the standards that you've had for these as well. Public health and safety. Some of the things we did was just rearrange these to make them a little bit more chronological, or to make them make sense a little bit better. We, I think, combined public health and public safety and made it one section. 20.
All right, hold on just 1 second. Mr. Gates, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry. I'm sort of running a little behind the presentation, but can I go back to page 4, line 8? it's the protest of continuous operation. And I just think that this is a little out of place where it's out, and that I guess I would suggest a subsection C that deals with only those protests of a continued operation. Because as I understand in state regulation, it's in the middle of the licensee's 2-year period, the local governing body may do that kind of protest. But it's not after receiving an application or anything from NCO. It's just initiated by the local governing body because the operator's a problem operator, they're a bad actor, and we want to initiate something on our end before the license renewal comes up. And I just think it's very different from the process in subsection B, public hearing on an application that's received. They can do a protest or conditional protest. Anyways, so I would just recommend a little restructuring there and not really changing the language all that much, but a subsection C.
Okay.
If
So,
that makes sense.
if I may, Dee and I went back and forth on this. We put it under public hearings because it is an item that would require a public hearing. If we are going to protest the continued operation, a public hearing is required. So it got placed under that public hearings heading. The other argument is it is still under its renewal application that was submitted if it's a protest of continued operation. So the initial renewal application was submitted, and we're still working off of that application to protest the continued operation of it. So that was kind of the legal, procedural reasoning for putting it there.
Maybe I can talk and discuss outside. I agree it requires a public hearing, so that's sort of the common element. But I don't think I agree with that last part. That is looking off the renewal application. It's looking off an approved license, I think.
And I think you're right, Dean, in the sense that if you read the section 2 there, protest says that, wait, it's not that section, it's the waiver section. It's 1. If there is no request for a protest or hearing from an assembly member or relevant committee, all certifications required have been received. Wait, I'm sorry, I lost the section. It's the section that says basically you waive your right to protest at a certain point in time.
Above it.
Yeah, there you go. So
Yeah.
the assembly waives its right to protest if the assembly fails to protest within the time designated by the state. That argues it's not the application, right? Because that period has ended, whether we protested or not, within the time frame allowed under the state law. And so, right, so I think Dean's really on to a point there, that section that's on a protest that comes up in the operation of the license, not at the renewal or the creation, it doesn't fit under the application. And so I don't know, Dean.
I think just a little restructuring though, it still fits in that whole section 2.22.
And so, and then back to where you were on your previous presentation, again, public health and safety, part A, that's page 6, lines 1 through 5. We have that term there, licensed premises. And this is where we have to look carefully because we continue to argue that a licensee has responsibility over the parking lot and the off-site impacts that they're creating, in particular of anywhere that they have leasehold and control, which is not just the line on the application within which they have the license to serve alcohol, right? So it is definitely an area we have to address. It's page 6, part 3, section A, license premises. Because the determination of whether the operator maintains order and prevents unlawful conduct extends beyond the floor on which they're selling alcohol.
Anna?
Yeah, thanks, this is Anna. That's a good example of kind of a technical change that I think will help local governments and businesses and the ABC board in the state law changes. So one of the requirements now is an annotated premises diagram, because that wasn't explicitly stated. And so it doesn't mean an architectural diagram, but it really means like, here's your licensed premises, here's your unlicensed premises. And then I think things, even though it sounds small, I think things like that will help everybody basically review and be more clear about what the whole property is or what the whole operation is.
Right, and I think that the current process, they do provide a drawing of where they serve food and where they serve alcohol and where their broom closet is, but none of it manages the externalities in any way. And so that's a conversation we should probably have, and that's probably for round 2, right? Is how far out does the premises extend that they are responsible for? And in the downtown, they don't have parking requirements, but everywhere else they do. Well, not anymore, but effectively that parking lot that they have is in their control, and that's often where the trouble happens, is outside. So come back to that.
And I will say, yeah, this is all current language. So this, anything like that, I would say, yes, that's discussions to pull for the follow-up ordinance that are gonna be the policy questions. So really, like, all of this is what it's already been for years and years.
Yeah.
Chris?
Thank you. To Assemblymember Constance's point, this is an issue that I wrestled with for over a decade in downtown when I was at the Downtown Partnership. It's very unclear where that nexus is for policymakers to make that call. I'd suggest that we examine Juneau's code. Juneau has a good list of criteria that their governing body uses when they're evaluating whether to protest a license or not. It mirrors the state and ours a little bit, but also goes beyond and addresses some of the points that Assemblymember Constant raised. So since we have the power to make codes that are more restrictive, not less restrictive than state law, you might want to look at those and see when you have that policy discussion if it's worth adding some.
Ready? You want to continue?
Okay. So page 6, line 37, reports of violations of conditions. This is a situation where if the assembly has placed conditions on the special land use permit, you would review that. But the licensing side, you also have the ability to request conditions be placed on the license by the board, the ABC board. And part of the monitoring of that, if the local government finds that an establishment isn't abiding by those, they have the ability to report those violations to the ABC board.
I'm sorry.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson here. If you go back to, you jumped ahead of me. I wasn't quite ready to move.
Sorry.
Section 4 on page 6. And then going back to page 3, section 2A. And section 2A states, a protest by the assembly cannot be based in whole or in part on police reports or other written materials available to the muni, but which were not provided to the affected owner or operator before the public hearing. So I think maybe I answered my question just reading it more closely and out loud. It says, whole or in part, cannot be based in whole or in part on police reports or other written materials available to the municipality. Well, but they were available, so there's a conflict here. 2A, and then you go over to 4, it says the assembly may consider police reports, criminal convictions, credible proof of activities, if not prosecuted, testimony presented before the assembly, written comments submitted. So what I'm not able to square here is this idea that imagine you have a testifier that comes forward and says, I have all these police reports, all of this trouble happened, all of these violations, but the assembly, when making the protest, didn't have that information or didn't know, but the muni did, because they're muni records. Does that mean that those comments are or are not allowable in the protest?
So I think part of how we've handled this before with protests are at meetings, it's being provided to you and the licensee as kind of like the laid on the table documents, like you guys are getting it there. And maybe Dean, you wanna delve into that a little bit more?
Thank you. So I recall this 2A requiring it be provided to the licensee. What is that? 10 days prior? Excuse me. That's part of state regulations requirement that we have to comply with anyways. So it just means, our staff need to make sure they get all the evidence that's going to be used to the licensee before the public hearing, otherwise we simply can't consider it. And so you can't consider it if it's been provided under that, I guess, on page 6, subsection 4.
You
So,
can't?
2A is just required by state law.
No, right, so that's the question, is, so 2A, there's a requirement that they receive the information that we're basing the protest on, but then a later process, the public hearing that's required, develops information relating to municipal enforcement actions that occurred before the public hearing. Is that information not usable?
That occurred before the public hearing. I guess if you have testimony, that's not something you provide, but the documentation, evidence, is something you need to provide. If you have persons and stuff, I guess that's a good question. If you have to provide the name of persons expected to provide testimony, I don't think so. But
so Dean,
that's within that time period.
Not the people, but say the neighbor to the proposed facility comes back and says the operator had 10 different complaints, calls that are logged with police reports because they were a bad operator. But we didn't provide that information before because it never really came up. But it came up through the public hearing. Is that not allowable?
Provided by a neighbor or somebody in the local government.
But it's a muni record.
That is a good question. I would need to look into that.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
No, that's good.
Excellent. I just want to note that we have 7 minutes, unless we extend.
We're gonna need a meeting one.
Okay, so.
So we're page 7. And you were just describing actions by the clerk, I think. Page 6. Notice of council.
You would just be
Okay.
delving into reports of violations and conditions for alcohol
Okay,
license.
yeah.
before we revert
If
back.
there's a natural break in the presentation, if you consider the time,
We
that would
can
be
probably do this, and then the next one will be section 3, so we can finish this, and then that'll be section 3. I mean, generally, I kind of went over it. It's just the assembly has the authority to notify the Alcohol Beverage Control Board if violations of conditions have happened. And that's typically correspondence is directed by an application, and this is that allowance that if there's something going on, you have the authority to notify them of it, and request that action be brought against the licensee. So that's it for sections 1 and 2, and we can pick up with section 3, which is clerk's stuff. And I wanted to say, part of trying to get this before you guys, we wanted to try and give enough time for situations like this to do some more clarification if we needed to add anything or move anything around. But really, this was just kind of clean up what we currently have. And I would say any of those bigger questions would be better suited towards the policy AO following it up.
Any questions?
So I do have one. I'm kind of back and forth in an email right now with sponsors of this item and the drafters. And the question is, do we lay this on the table on Tuesday, or do we wait to introduce it until the next meeting and have another meeting here where we just wrestle with the context and make sure we've had an opportunity to review it? And, you know, I find myself in an unusual position. I've never really didn't like laid on the table items, but now I'm in a position where they kind of make my heart beat a little bit because there are so many that come and I have to manage them with the clerk. And so if I had my bias, it would be, let's wait a meeting, introduce it in June 6th, hear it on June 20th, but have another committee meeting to get through sections 3 through 10.
Yeah, I would agree with that, simply because we've only got to section 3, we've already had some pretty good dialogue.
And much of the change from our discussion will be in round 2. Probably a lot of it we won't address here, and that's okay. We'll not have a what's the word, a grounding in the matter by then.
And additionally, just to admit, I've never gone through the alcohol licensing, so I'm learning a lot through this process, just going through this. So I would appreciate some time to make sure I wrap my head around. I might have another conversation with Anna here, because apparently she's immersed in it.
I think
you obviously have some pretty substantial experience with this as well.
Yeah, and I heard you were going to learn by doing, by starting a bar, so.
Is that what it was?
I think you said that to me, so.
Protest. That is my retirement.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Any closing comments or any other thoughts as we wrap up here? We're right at the end of our allotted time.
Just one is thank you to the staff and the contractor attorney that's helped draft all of this. It's a lot of work.
Yes.
And maybe the next meeting we have the crosswalk.
Yes.
That would be helpful for next week.
There, and before we go to see if there's anybody with public comment, I did want to mention that there was one other item, and I want to say it was 14G, and I can't remember forgetting because I can't find my notes. There was another big package of omnibus of items that were referred back to the CDC, and we were going to do a separate meeting. We haven't established a date for that.
It was driveway and site access standards.
That's what it was, driveway site access. I just want to make sure you guys are all aware, we need to establish a date for that, because we extended that, I think, out to the June 20th.
Yeah.
So, and I think that one, because of the size of that presentation, and I'm not sure who will be providing that presentation from the planning department.
Tom Davis.
Excuse me?
Tom Davis.
Yeah, Tom Davis. We'll want to make sure he has adequate time for a presentation. So if somebody from the department here would give to Tom and see how much time he needs in order to put something together to explain, much like we asked Daniel, what is the differences, what is it we can do here, and then that way we can have a very effective meeting. We'll probably designate one just strictly for that, because it was a couple hundred pages.
He is on leave for another week, but when he gets back, I'll have him get in touch.
All right, fantastic. Any other comments before we go to public? Is there anybody on the phone? Okay.
Just a process question. You have two amendments that were in the packet for today. One that relates to 23-42 that we talked about. And I don't see either of the sponsors here, so I guess we can't really talk about it, but that was in the packet. And then there's one for AO 23-43, which I don't see on the agenda anywhere, so I was curious. Again, the sponsor's not here, so does anybody know what this amendment is about?
This is Anna. I think, I mean, I didn't put this on the table, but this has to do with what was passed, I believe, the downtown code changes. And then I know there's been some community response about the changes around Town Square Park. So I think it might just be the language of that, but I don't know what the intent is.
Yeah, I couldn't find the ordinance on the agenda, so.
Yeah.
But anyway, there is one amendment if you wanted to discuss it before you close out. So.
Yeah, real quick here, where are we at? Do we have
0.
10-minute extension? Are we good with extending for 10 minutes? Yeah. Excellent. And we can discuss. That is the Assembly members, the Rivera and Zalatel, proposed amendment number 1 to AO 2023-42. Okay. Yeah, and I don't see either of them here, but I'll just read it real quick. Proposed amendment. Proposed summary of amendment removes the R4A district from rules which apply special height restrictions depending on neighboring properties designated for certain residential uses in the comprehensive plan. This amendment provides more flexibility to R4A zone properties. And then we have the text of the amendment. Daniel, did you want to chime in on your thoughts on this and what that does, positive or negative effects on?
Yeah, I thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Daniel McKenna Foster, Long Range Planning. So in the whole R4A district, what we're really trying to do is get rid of all the stuff that refers to R4A and just get it into R4A. So you'll see that in the AO that there's a big chunk that's going back into R4, these bonuses that really only apply to R4. This is another thing that came up recently that was a special rule that applied for height transitions between R4A and other districts. So pretty much it said how you use R4A depends on what's next to you, which is kind of difficult also because it's in Chapter 6, which is not where you might normally look for this kind of standard, because it is sort of a design standard, but it's not in 21 of 7. So this is just one of those things where I won't say if it's good or bad, but it is changing a rule that says that when you're building an R4A, you have to look at what's next to it before you can build in it. That's just taking that away.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cox.
Yeah, no, this is very intriguing because we have this amendment in the previous item, which was 2023-43. When I reviewed it, my mistake, I only read the front page. I didn't see the back page. which allowed that substantial height increase without any real public input in the conversation to Town Square, which has been the subject of a lot of concern from people and heartburn, and we're going to hear about it Tuesday night from at least 2 people. And my question on this one is, so I saw that map of Fairview. There's some pretty tight residential areas. Are we now saying that if somebody has 3 lots, they can go up 80 feet next to a 2-story building?
If I may, through the chair.
Yes, sir.
So the height limit in R4 is 60 feet unless there's a site plan review, and then it can go up to 90. So a site plan review would.
90 feet, right. So but there's no consideration of abutting properties then if we do this change.
Well, the thinking is that if you're in an area that can be zoned into R4A, the comp plan has already designated that this is going to be a mixed-use area in the future. This is going to be an area that is probably going to be 35 dwelling units per acre or more. And so by removing this, it's saying, okay, there's certain areas in the municipality where it's okay to have density, and if we really want to have that, we should let that happen. And so the other thing too is that 200 feet of any lot designated in the comprehensive plan is large lot residential, single family detached, single family attached, detached. So that means that the possibility of getting to R4A will be limited on what's around it. And so R4A generally, if the plan was done well, which I believe it was, should be in areas where the community's already said, this is an area where we want 35 dwellings per acre or more.
And I can assure you on that map, nobody around there wants a 90-foot building or has been asked that question. And so seeing that map and contemplated, what does it mean to have a 90-foot building erupt in this generally 2 to 4 story section of town? And so it's an interesting concern.
Well, it says in the R4A you can already go up to 70 feet in an existing code. So changing it to 60 with an admin site plan review up to 90.
But what we're asking in this is to actually identify some places as R4A that historically haven't been. And so we're changing, the proposal is to change R4 to R4A or other zones to that. And I don't think people have contemplated if this amendment passes that suddenly every property doesn't matter. You could have all 2-story buildings or 1-story buildings and then a 90-story building come up in between just with site plan review.
Daniel, does your ordinance expand where you can have R4A?
No, we didn't change the land use plan.
Yeah.
And so one, people would have to rezone into it, which has its whole host of things. But really this comes down to, should somebody who has R4A, if you get that entitlement of that zone, do you get what's allowed in that zone, or do you always have to be looking at rates?
So is that section in Fairview right now zoned R4A?
No.
The only zone R4A zoning is in Mid-Tuck.
So
now.
we're having a very fine discussion about what it means to be zoned or change zoning to what I guess the difference is allowed to be changed with certain processes to R4A. That could include this 90-foot next to a 2-story building. That I never heard that in any of my councils that have this property potential happening in their neighborhoods. And so I think it's worth hearing from them or having them contemplate this, because this is an amendment that's just coming out of nowhere. No one's even seen it. And so this isn't on you guys, this is maybe on the movers of the amendment. But the fact is, after the meeting, when I learned, I voted to support putting shadow on Town Square Park. That was my mistake. I'm not going to make that mistake again and not hear from my neighbors.
Daniel. Through the chair, well, I'd be glad to provide all the presentations and all the public councils that I went to. And we did talk about height, because that's...
You talked about height, but you talk about we're going to eliminate... Did you talk about this amendment at those councils?
Well, so this is the thing, is that we talked about height as if that height was a by right thing, right? Mm-hmm. And this is a different thing that says you actually can't get to that height because you have to do these special step downs depending on what's around it. So when we talked about it, I actually wasn't even aware that this was here, that there would be that sort of restriction on it. So when I went and talked to people, I said, this is the height, this is the possibility, this is the comp plan says this is an area. So this is actually something that says, well, it's not actually that height, because you have to look at what is something nearby.
Right, and that's what all the neighbors have depended on in the last 10, 15 years I've been involved, is that any plan for a development would be in the context of the local neighborhood, not just a radical transformation today. And so this is not your problem, this is my problem. I have to figure out how to square this. And I will be having some conversations with the folks that generally
Okay.
do this.
Chris, did you have your hand up?
I'm done, thank you.
You're good, and then,
Francis McLaughlin, Current Planning, just for the benefit of the conversation. So there's almost no R4A in town. It's only in 2 places in town. The Country Lane Estates near the intersection of Old Seward and Tudor Road, across from that big brown jug, right? And then at the J.J. Brooks Arctic site, right? Those are the only 2 places R4A. So anywhere that there's going to be R4A outside of those 2 areas, it would take a rezoning to that district. And that's a community meeting, 2 public hearings. So I'm not arguing or disagreeing or trying to. I just, for the benefit of the conversation, that if there is to be any R4A in Fairview or any other area designated in the comp plan and so on, it would take 2 public hearings, community meeting. The assembly would have to adopt a zoning map amendment, and when you rezone to a district, you look at what are the maximum number of dwelling units you can build, what is the height allowance. You would be looking at the zoning district and whether or not it's appropriate, and what would the impacts be on the surrounding properties, and how would they be mitigated in that. So a rezone, that was found to be inappropriate height could be denied, right?
But this code amendment would argue that it is fine. I mean, that amendment, once that's in the code, the argument would be, that's fine. You could have 70 or 90
What
feet.
Daniel's saying is he wants the R4A to have this height because that implements the intended purpose of the zone. You're saying that, per acreage 2040, you don't want, that do the people in Fairview or do people in neighborhoods where R4A is designated to potentially go, is allowed to be rezoned to, do they know about this height? And what Daniel's response was, yeah, that's what was presented to them.
But do they know about it in the context of that it won't take into consideration the properties nearby as a factor in the code right now? This eliminates that.
So what Daniel said is that was never raised. No. What he's saying is that he didn't present that that there could be
Limits.
another stipulation or restriction
Limits.
limiting height based on neighbor. So they're just assuming that by right they could go to this height if this should be adopted.
I
And
don't
so
know.
this is not a change.
My friends in Fairview recognize the limits that have been historically applied to development. And so that would be just a stipulated fact to them, you wouldn't have to say it to them. That's what they would know because that's what the code is, and they're masters of this. And so,
Mr. Constance, if we could, Anna, you've been waiting for some time.
It strikes me with both of these that it brings up really 2 big issues that I know this community has kind of wrestled with for a long time. One is solar access. What legal rights do we have to solar access? And I know that's always been a really difficult discussion, and there isn't a blanket decision in code, but it comes out in these specific areas. And the other one is the really fundamental question of land use, which is what are people's property rights, and then what are their obligations or limits on those property rights based on impacts to neighbors. I mean, that's the crux of land use code, right? And so it's interesting to look at these in particular. And I know in Alaska, solar access is really important because we all love the sun because we don't get a whole lot of it for certain times of the year. But I think anyway, it's interesting to think about the bigger picture too, which is. I know other cities have air rights, where you can literally sell the air above your building as there's other ways that cities have dealt with this. So I don't have a specific proposal for either of these, but I think it is interesting to look at these 2 as part of a much bigger question.
Thank you. We're out of time, and I apologize. I won't be able to extend. I'll have to leave my next meeting. Do we have anybody that had? Oh, sorry. Was there any audience participation before we?
A couple of numbers on the phone, but they're not muted if you want to ask.
Is there anybody on the line that would like to provide some audience participation? Hearing none. Excellent. So moving on, our next meeting will continue on with the alcohol license changes, and please let me know if you have any other additional items, and then we'll have a separate meeting for the 14G for the site plan review, or not site plan review, lot size review and adjustments. Chairman, I look for a motion to adjourn.
May I make one announcement?
Yes,
Not a
Chris.
public announcement, just a plug for the Assembly's Housing Summit, which occurs tomorrow, 9 to 4:30, I think, at LUSAC, so.
And then a social event at 5:30 afterwards.
And then social afterwards, so.
Thank you. No, we're adjourned.